Okay, so I should be going. All right.
No, wait, it's okay. We just wanted to make sure the recording had started. So now we're good.
Okay. All right,
So,
great.
I'm going to let in our last guest here. And I want to welcome everybody to Zach Stoltzfus's presentation. We are very pleased to have awarded him our Martin Veggie Fellowship for his dissertation. And he's going to be talking to us about his research and also about the experience of applying for and using the fellowship. And we, after his talk, welcome questions on both those topics. So I'm going to turn this over to Zach.
Well, thanks, Dr. Mooney. I'm going to start by sharing my PowerPoint presentation. I'd also like to start by just thanking the Martin Veggie family for funding graduate students in their research, including my research. It was certainly an eventful semester, the spring of 2020, but I was able to complete several drafts of the first 3 chapters, and I might not have otherwise accomplished that writing had it not been for the award. Also want to thank the FSU History Department for granting the award, as well as my advisor, Dr. Blaufarb, for all of his helpful guidance and feedback as I've continued to revise my work arguments, as well as my dissertation committee, Dr. Upchurch, Dr. Wood, Dr. Hanley, as well as Dr. Jeff Horn from Manhattan College, who was able to make it today, who has also provided me with a lot of great feedback, and all of you for being here for this presentation. Credit, as several historians have pointed out, was an all-encompassing category in the early modern world. It not only referred to one's monetary situation, but was often interchangeable with the word confiance, which is French for trust. Credit was multifaceted. It signified different types of trust in different contexts. For example, a tanner might be in good credit when evaluated for his abilities or position within a guild. At the same time, pre-existing monetary debts might make him a bad financial risk. The word crédit, bad or good, no longer serves then as a reliable guide for the historian investigating monetary loans, at least in the old regime. But we also know from studies, such as those done by Philip T. Hoffman, Gilles Postal-Venet, and Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, that financial markets in old regime France were vibrant, even with this conceptual confusion surrounding the word crédit. How to explain this vibrancy? Claire Krauston and Philip T. Hoffman and his co-authors explain this vibrancy by focusing on financial credit as relationships of obligation. What was the old regime, after all, if not a vast network of obligations? Vassals owed their seigneurs annual oaths of loyalty and feudal dues. The Catholic Church owed the monarchy an annual gift in exchange for the protections and privileges afforded it by the crown. There are endless examples of social and economic obligations in the old regime, including financial obligations between lenders and borrowers. In Krauston's case, she highlights how fashion was used to enhance one's social credit. This is going to be the only slide that will be consisting of a lot of longer quotes, so just bear with me, but the rest will be mainly pictures. But in Krauston's work on credit, fashion, sex, economies of regard in the old regime, she points out how the French people had a rich and deep, fine-grained, expansive, and nuanced answer to the question of what is credit and how does it operate. When French people invoked the term credit, they often meant an informal sort of influence and power rather than access to financial resources. Just moving this this view bar so I can better read these quotes. Meanwhile, Philip T. Hoffman and his co-authors focus on notaries as third parties instrumental in negotiating financial credit between lenders and borrowers. As you can see from this quote here, the gray officials who drew up contracts and legal documents, the Parisian notaries, played a crucial financial role in the 18th century. They were in fact the very intermediaries who animated the Parisian credit market under the old regime. The goal of my dissertation is not to contest the conclusions of these eminent historians, but to complicate them and perhaps complement them. I do this by looking at French legal sources themselves, notarial archives, and the personal papers of various families. These sources reveal that financial credit in old regime France in fact exhibited attributes of modern credit, namely impersonal exchange and negotiability, through the mortgaging of real property, such as land and houses. I have one final quote here, and this is from a work on 20th century credit markets, but I believe that its insights are still applicable to old regime France. James Greenberg and Thomas Park point out that modern credit has developed two attributes that signify or that highlight its modern aspects, which is to say negotiability and abstraction, or impersonability of exchange. So in other words, credit is no longer consisting of one's extended social network, one's friends and family. It's no longer just merely a matter of informal loans that are being exchanged within a community, but it's starting to stretch beyond that community and encompass people that might not know each other. And while Hoffman and his co-authors signal that or identify notaries as that crucial intermediary linking up creditors with debtors, my own research identifies an even more important mediator between debtors and creditors, which is not a person at all, but rather the legal instrument of lipotech. By making financial credit impersonal rather than reputational, lipotech laid the literal groundwork for the replacement of old regime socioeconomic categories with the principle of economic equality before the law. What was, or I should say is, lipotech? Lipotech is a specific type of financial credit, the non-possessory pledge of property as collateral for a loan or similar financial obligation, such as a dowry or land rent. In the event of default, a lender could use the authority granted to them by Ipotec to take their borrower to court with the intention of expropriating part of their borrower's property equal to the amount of debt still owed. Following the explication of this term by 16th century French scholars of Roman law, the practice gained widespread acceptance. Like crédit, the word lipotech could be used in a variety of ways in old regime France, depending on the context. For example, someone in poor health was said to be bien hypothéqué, or well mortgaged. While the word is often translated today as mortgage, this isn't quite correct, as the word mortgage also existed in the old regime and meant something slightly different, a dead pledge. Lipotech is a living pledge, in that the debtor retains full usage and ownership of the property leveraged for a loan, with its revenues going towards the servicing of that loan. The best definition is perhaps offered by the writings of Charles Loiseau, one of the foremost legal scholars of France following the Wars of Religion. In 1601, Loiseau published his treatise on eviction and abandonment by hypothèque. In this work, he distinguished between obligations owed seigneurs, or lords, and obligations owed creditors. Like his predecessor, Charles Dumoulin, Loiseau drew a sharp distinction between the relationship of a vassal with their lord, which he describes as a personal obligation only ended through eviction, and the relationship between a debtor and a creditor. This latter relationship was not personal, but impersonal, because it was mediated not by a person, but by a thing, the gage, the property used as lipotech. As you can see from this quote here, lipotech was an accessory or subsidiary obligation on the thing to confirm and ensure the promised obligation of the debtor. As Loiseau says elsewhere in the same work, the person or the debtor merely acts as a steward of the debt. Quote, since the gage cannot pay for itself without the ministry of the person, end quote. This meant that debt followed property, not persons, something readily apparent to historians who spend time in the notarial archives. As one can ascertain from looking through some of these notarized documents, widows are reimbursing the debts of their deceased husbands, heirs the debts of their parents. This is because, along with inheriting the property from their deceased relatives, they are also inheriting the debt attached to that property. How did debts backed by lipotech work? First of all, they were notarized. Notarized debts were contracted as either annuities or obligations. There were several species of annuities in circulation in old regime France, including life annuities and what were known as rentes constituées or constituted annuities. Life annuities were annuity payments that ended at the death of the creditor. The way that annuities worked was that the creditor purchased an annuity from a debtor, and the debtor was obligated to make yearly payments to their creditor. Typically, those payments were at 5% interest. The annuity continued until the principal was repaid or 30 years had lapsed. Annuities could also be set up through the alienation not of capital, but of land, such as the case with land rents, where the creditor or credit rentier would alienate either land or homes in exchange for yearly annuity payments. In the case of rentes constituées or constituted annuities, and in the case of obligations, that which was alienated by the creditor was a lump sum of capital exclusively. The legal limit on interest, as I mentioned, was 5%, but obligations disguised interest rates higher than this legal ceiling by lumping them in with the principal of the loan. Obligations also differed from annuities in mandating a due date for the repayment of the loan. I should also just mention that bills of exchange and other credit instruments that were in circulation amongst merchants, these did not have lipotech entered into the equation. They were a sort of a different class of credit instrument. In the case of bills of exchange, because there was no property leveraged as collateral, if a merchant failed to repay their debts, they could legally be imprisoned, their person substituted in place of land as collateral on the loan. Erica Vals talks a lot about that in her recent book, The Red and the Black. I wish I had more time to talk about some of the theology behind these different types of loans. That is a subject for a different presentation, but I would just, anybody that's interested in that, I would point them in the direction of Charlie Coleman's work that just came out this week, The Spirit of French Capitalism, Economic Theology in the Age of Enlightenment. But in addition to these different types of loans, of annuities and obligations, there were also two different types of lipotech. There was general hypothec and there was special hypothec. In the notarial contract that would record the loan between the creditor and the debtor, the notary would either write it as a general hypothec or as a special hypothec, depending on the terms of the contract. The main difference being that a general hypothec is an hypothec on all of the debtor's property, both movable and immovable, as well as present and future, whereas special hypothec pertains only to the properties that would be listed in the credit contract itself. Why are debtors and creditors rushing to notarize these credit contracts? Is it simply to give them peace of mind? Is it because they are worried about not being repaid? That certainly is playing a role in it. There's also the rise of credit contracts between individuals that don't know each other, and so they don't know if they're trustworthy. But another factor that's playing into this is the 1566 Ordonnance de Moulins, which was created by Michel de l'Hôpital, who was Chancellor of France during the regency of Catherine de' Medici. This was during the wars of religion. The 1566 Ordonnance de Moulins which was different than the Edict of Moulins. It was a separate legislative act, mandated that all loans 100 livre or greater be notarized in order to bear the weight of legal enforcement. So in other words, if one did not notarize loans 100 livre or more, those loans would not be upheld in a court of law. This proved to be a powerful incentive to both debtors and creditors to have their loans be notarized. Of course, it did not mean that unnotarized loans less than or more than 100 livre simply stopped circulating, but it did provide a strong encouragement for notarizing loans and provided laid out the means by which the legal forms that would take. So by the 16th century, it's very common for creditors and debtors, especially if they don't know each other, and especially if the amount of the loan is more than 100 livre, to notarize that loan. And in that notarial contract is the l'hypothèque clause, regardless if it's an annuity or an obligation. Typically, the clause for general hypothèque would read, as I said, an hypothèque on all property, movable and immovable, present and future. The special hypothèque would list which properties that pertain to. But why were more and more Frenchmen and women searching for loans at this time? Why were credit markets experiencing this increased demand for loans? Well, one of the problems was that France has a long history of a dearth of hard currency or of coins. Even if you go the whole way back to, say, immediately following the rule of Charlemagne, you had Viking incursions on the West Coast, and the King of France at that time could not scrounge up enough coins to bribe the Vikings to leave, so he granted them the Duchy of Normandy in exchange for them to stop harassing his subjects. So there's this long-standing problem of a lack of specie. Now, the monarchy has tried to address this problem by minting more coins, but that's only part of the issue. They also have to establish these types of procedures so that creditors and debtors who don't know each other well can exchange that coinage, using a system where they trust that they'll be repaid. And hypothèque helped underwrite that trust during the old regime. But what's driving this desire for loans? The answer to this question is endlessly diverse. It's dependent on the unique financial situation of each debtor. But it does bring to light several interesting trends. One of the first institutions to adopt l'hypothèque as a solution for its financial woes was, in fact, the Crown. By converting short-term loans that were contracted for interest rates as high as 25%, by converting these into long-term annuities sold to its own subjects for interest rates around 8%, and backed by the hypothèque of the royal domain, the monarchy could better fund the emerging fiscal military state, whose costs were being driven ever upward by new weaponry, such as cannon, new military tactics that required large standing armies. During the 17th century, the continent of Europe was only to experience a mere 3 years of peace. There was constantly some war raging in the background, or intimately involving the monarchs of France. The Catholic Church as well, the largest landowner in France, likewise used l'hypothèque to secure loans so they could continue to offer its various social services, schooling and hospitals and so forth. The First Estate, like the monarchy, was protected from lawsuits by unpaid creditors. This is an important point because it allowed the church to leverage their property without experiencing repercussions in the courts. The expenses required to maintain one's social rank in the high nobility also prompted this class to use l'hypothèque to procure credit. In 1522, King Francois I inadvertently created the first national debt when he used the tax revenues of the Hôtel de Ville of Paris to as hypothèque for an annuity that was sold to a consortium of merchants in Paris. So that's one early example of the monarchy adopting this, this tool, which is allowing them to tap into greater and greater reserves of credit from their own subjects, which is allowing them to fund these wars that are being waged in the case of Francois I against both Aragon and or against Charles V in Spain. I'm sorry, in Italy. But also this was being used by, as well, the lower nobility. It was starting to spread throughout all of France. This excerpt that I have here, I found in the archives in Alsace. And this is actually a feudal lord who owns land both in the Holy Roman Empire and in France. And he's asking special permission from the king, or letters of patent from the king, so that he can leverage his lands in the Holy Roman Empire for loans. He has to ask special permission because the laws of this time stipulated that you could only use French lands to obtain as hypothèque for loans. So if you wanted to use land you owned outside of France, like this individual did, you had to ask special permission from the king himself. He was granted permission to do that. Interestingly, both venal offices, which also emerged under the reign of Francois I, and seigneurie, which is to say feudal lordship, were treated by French law as immovable by fiction, meaning that they could be used as l'hypothèque for more loans. This is further evidence of how personal credit tied to one's social station was transformed into impersonal credit by treating these titles and offices not as merely as royal titles, but as property in and of themselves. But for the vast majority of French subjects who did not own a venal office or seigneurie, they had to rely on their land and their buildings to serve as hypothèque for these formal notarized credit transactions. What of the other marker of modern credit or modern credit exchanges? Negotiability. On this front, Philip T. Hoffman and his co-authors identify notaries as playing a crucial role. According to their thesis, notaries acted as a disinterested third party. They helped negotiate obligations at interest rates that were favorable to both debtors and creditors. There are problems with Hoffman and his co-authors' thesis, however. This includes its scope, which is limited solely to Parisian notaries involved in high finance. There's also the issue of whether or not notaries were truly disinterested parties. After all, they made their money by charging processing fees for every contract that they notarized. Every annuity or obligation that they would have passed on represented money lost. There were also only 113 notaries for all of Paris between the years of 1639 and 1790. During this same period, the population of the city grew by 300%. It would have been impossible for Parisian notaries to adequately vet creditors and debtors, serving as this vital intermediary, given the rise of population and increasing demand for credit that occurred during the 17th and 18th centuries. One would expect that the oversight that notaries provided, at least according to Hoffman and Gilles Postel-Venet and Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, would be matched by a decline in defaults. After all, according to their argument, these notaries are providing a vital service, making sure that creditors are not entering into these notarized contracts with debtors that are going to default or have poor credit history. But of course, that's not what happens at all. In fact, there is a spike in defaults that occurs, especially in the 18th century. This happened for a variety of reasons unrelated to notaries, who rather as acting as intermediaries, are perhaps better described as clerks who gave contracts the imprimatur of the law. Further proof of notaries' ambivalence to acting as intermediaries can be seen in the prevalence of what was known as voluntary decrees. A voluntary decree was a notarized decree obtained by a party who acted in the place of a creditor and declared before a notary property to be free of all hypothek. In other words, a voluntary decree attested to the purging of an hypothek from a piece of property. But these were often fraudulently obtained. Another example of fraud was something known as stilionat, the leveraging of land not actually owned by a debtor in exchange for a loan. These types of fraud show that notaries actually were unable to successfully regulate credit markets, and it contributed to the economic destabilization that's happening in the 18th century as more and more loans are being taken out, but fewer and fewer are being repaid, and more debtors are going into default. But why are so many debtors defaulting in the latter half of the 18th century? The short answer is that they had over-leveraged their land with l'hypothèque. In the decades following the 7 Years' War, there is a marked shift as investors, often referred to in documents as capitalists, pivoted from buying land to investing in annuities and obligations. According to Robert Joseph Poitier, such investments comprise, quote, the largest part of the patrimony, often all of the patrimony of a great number of families. As these loans to repayment that the creditors enjoyed through these loans was passed down generationally to their children and grandchildren, who continued to draw revenue from their repayment. Investors from all three estates participated in this market for loans, lending money to landowners who hoped to use an infusion of capital to improve their land, or perhaps purchase an ennobling venal office, or fund a dowry for a daughter, or a military commission for a son, or acquire seigneury or other trappings of the nobility as they advanced through the social ranking of old regime France. Annuities and obligations could also be sold to third parties. Obligations, since they hid interest rates and set a due date, increasingly became the preferred means of contracting these loans, but they carried their own inherent risks. Unlike annuities, they did not involve yearly payments. Thus, it could be many years until a creditor realized that they had made a poor investment. The market for contracting loans outpaced the collateral available for l'hypothèque. Borrowers eager for capital over-leveraged their land. Lenders, with no way to know if a borrower was already deeply indebted, continued to contract annuities and obligations to set up trusts for their children and to create multiple streams of revenue. Why didn't these creditors who were failing to be repaid for their investment, why did they not merely take their debtors, their defaulting debtors, to court and use the power of the hypothèque clause contained in their contract to force their debtors to repay or to foreclose upon their debtors' property, thus recovering their losses? Unfortunately for creditors, French law required proof that debtors acted knowingly in bad faith before the expropriation of their property could be carried out by a judicial order. This was very difficult to prove. It required great patience and expense as cases wended their way through the courts. It was often less costly simply to sell ownership of an unpaid annuity or obligation to an unsuspecting buyer. In this way, fraud was compounded and spread throughout France. A forced decree, which is what is pictured here, was much easier to obtain than court-ordered foreclosure. Issued by a judge, forced decrees validated the hypothèque-backed debts, publicized the debt, and ratcheted up pressure on the debtor to repay the loan. As you can see here from this short excerpt, in this forced decree issued by a judge, the judge is listing some of the debts that are owed and some of the property that that the debtor had used as hypothèque to guarantee the debt's repayment. On the whole, however, the law failed to prevent the widespread over-leveraging of land and other properties by debtors eager for the capital necessary to climb the social hierarchy or even just to maintain their social position within the hierarchy of orders. The monarchy had long understood the nature of this problem. As early as 1673, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Controller General of Finances under King Louis XIV, had crafted a royal edict for the advertisement of all hypothèques in registries to be established in each bailliage or county throughout France. Colbert's edict was revoked by the king a year later amid the protestations of the nobility. But the problem of fraud did not go away. Later, under the reign of Louis XV, his Controller General of Finances, John Law, in a bid to introduce more specie into the economy of France, skirted around this problem of fraudulent hypothèque that was weighing down credit markets by simply perpetrating an even larger fraud on the French people in the form of a paper currency that eventually lost all of its value. In 1771, a new royal edict, this time at the tail end of Louis XV's reign, was crafted to deal with the problem of fraud and over-leveraged land. Written by the Abbé Terray, pictured here, the edict's promulgation occurred simultaneous with the exile and replacement of the Parlement, regional courts entrusted with entering the king's edict into the law books. This was no accident. Terray and the Chancellor of France, René de Maupeou, knew that the Parlement would refuse to register the new edict on hypothèque. Terray's 1771 edict did not require the advertisement of hypothèque as Colbert's had done in 1673. Instead, it required that each time land changed hands, the new acquirer of the land must compile a list of hypothèques attached to the property. This list would be evaluated by the chancery courts, who would then issue letters of ratification attesting to the value of the land and the validity of the hypothèque, similar in function and form to a forced decree. These letters of ratification would take the place of voluntary decrees, which were henceforth outlawed. Acquirers of land were next required to register these letters of ratification with their local hypothèque registry office. Officials of this new institution would contact the creditors listed in the letters of ratification so that they could either agree to be repaid for the amount listed or alternatively contest the amount in the form of a formal opposition filed with the hypothèque registry offices. Creditors had 2 months to file their oppositions. After 2 months had passed and all oppositions were resolved, the acquirer of the property in question could start the process of repaying the creditors, beginning with the oldest debts first. After all debts were repaid and all hypothèque purged from the land, the letters of ratification would be sealed, signifying that the property in question was free and clear. These procedures meant that buyers of annuities or of land could ask their seller for letters of ratification to attest in documented form the creditworthiness of the debtor or the seller before agreeing via a notarized contract to lend money or purchase the property. Notably, even the monarchy was subjected to these procedures, registering and sealing letters of ratification of its debts to holders of government annuities. One of the most prominent lawyers of the 19th century, Désiré Dallot, called this 1771 edict the last important act in civil law of the 18th century by the monarchy. But as with any major piece of new legislation, there were winners and there were losers. Who were the winners and losers of this new edict? The new law benefited the emerging investor class who had hoped to invest their social station by using revenue gleaned from interest-bearing loans to buy land, venal offices, and seigneurie. It did not necessarily benefit those who had already established their social position, yet were in constant need of funds to maintain their rank. The exiled parlementaires, that is to say, members of the various parlements that had been exiled by the Chancellor of France, the exiled parlementaires vigorously opposed Terray's 1771 edicts. Since each of the steps involved in procuring, registering, and sealing letters of ratification assessed a small fee, parlementaires argued that the new law was an example of unlawful taxation. Even more damningly, The 1771 edict violated the sacred nature of private contracts by involving the state. A large-scale public relations campaign was launched by parlementaires and their allies in legal profession to reinstate the exiled Parlement and to overturn Thérèse's 1771 edicts. Eventually, the law was simply abandoned in a partially implemented state by Louis XVI when he assumed the throne of France and restored the Parlement. I don't have it translated, but this is an example of a parlementaire contesting or writing against this new edict put forward by Thérèse. In this short excerpt, which is one of hundreds of such letters found in the archives, he discusses how the new law deprives seigneurs of their rights and their prerogatives of justice. It overloads individuals with excessive fees. It interferes with their freedom to sell their property. It imposes on them unusual procedures contrary to customary law and to municipal laws. It subverts all maintained customs and promises the ruin of the inhabitants of our land. So as you can see, very strong language was being employed to fight back against this law. The law was, as I said, abandoned in a partially implemented state. So by the time we arrive at 1788 and the king has decided to call the Estates General, the Cahiers de doléances, which are the lists of grievances compiled by each estate within France, the 1771 edicts on hypothèque appear time and time again in these cahiers amongst each of the three estates. The first estate talks about how it's, will willingly use their powers of the pulpit to publicize hypothèque if that proves to be advantageous for bringing order to credit markets. The second estate largely is against the 1771 edicts. The third estate, it's a mixture. You find those who oppose the edicts because of the fees involved, and then you find those who believe that Thérèse's 1771 edicts on hypothèque should be brought to their final conclusion. These hypothèque registry offices should be set up throughout France, and these procedures should be finally implemented. But the document pictured here is sort of just a summary of some of these complaints. What does all this mean for the coming of the French Revolution? And I understand I've spent most of my presentation talking about the old regime, but I'd like to very briefly touch on the revolution here near the end. Well, several historians, such as Vivian Gruder, have argued that the French Revolution begins in 1787 when the Assembly of Notables, the 144 most important figures in all of France, convened to discuss new land taxes proposed by the Controller General of Finances, Charles-Alexandre de Calonne. The notables successfully contested these taxes. Calonne was forced to retreat, and he was succeeded by Loménie de Brienne. De Brienne ends up agreeing to ask the king to call the Estates General, and the ball starts to roll, and the revolution starts to, although it hasn't happened yet, some of the grievances that the revolution seizes upon the groundwork for them starts to be laid. If you read the minutes of the Assembly of Notables, you notice that many of these notables are citing Jacques Necker's Compte Rendu, which was a public accounting of royal finances published by Necker in 1781 that erroneously suggested that the crown had a budget surplus. So prior to Calonne serving as Controller General of Finances, Jacques Necker had served as Director General of Royal Treasury. He was not allowed a place at the Council of State due to his status as a foreigner and Protestant, so he had a slightly different title. And while he was exercising that role, he published this accounting of all the king's finances that was in fact was skewed. Now, the members of the Assembly of Notables seized upon the Compte Rendu as evidence that there was no need for these new taxes, these new land taxes that Calonne was trying to implement, and the Assembly of Notables starts to fall apart, and the Estates General becomes an inevitability. Necker had his own reasons for pushing for the Compte Rendu. But had Thérèse's 1771 edicts been fully implemented, all of the crown's annuities would have been accounted for in letters of ratification recorded in hypothèque registry offices. So the failure of Thérèse's 1771 edicts on hypothèque leads in many ways to this budgetary crisis that's emerging in the years leading up to the French Revolution. And had it been successfully realized, certainly it would have shorn the compte rendu of its explanatory power that it had for notables at this time. So the failure of the 1771 edicts on hypothèque in some ways sets the stage for revolution. It galvanizes the legal profession to political activism, and it prevents an accurate reckoning of the royal debt. By now, we've talked about how financial credit in old regime France was in fact quite modern. It possessed abstraction and negotiability. It was highly impersonal and was mediated not by reputation, but by actual property through hypothèque. It was still hobbled by fraud, however. Credit contracts remained private. Creditors had no way of sounding out the credit worthiness of potential debtors under this system. Markers of social status, such as easily mimicked fashions, only exacerbated this problem of asymmetrical information. The secrecy of unregulated hypothèque also prevented the crown from directly tackling its debts. What do revolutionaries do about this problem? Keeping in mind, of course, that revolutionaries decide quite early on to honor the debts inherited from the monarchy. I address this in my dissertation, and I don't have adequate time to unpack all of their solutions, but I'll briefly touch on a few. It is not until the year 1798, that the government of the Directory finally prioritizes the passage of a new code hypothécaire. This poster that's pictured here only contains one aspect of that new code hypothécaire, the law concerning forced expropriation. In other words, the foreclosure on property owned by defaulting debtors. But the new code brought credit markets that had been decimated by the upheaval revolution roaring back to life. It mandated the evaluation of a borrower's land by a team of experts, the mathematical matching of the value of this land with loans recorded in hypothèque registries, just like those envisioned in 1673 and 1771, the advertisement of hypothèque, and the quick and inexpensive expropriation of land in the event a debtor defaulted, which is what we see here. What resulted from this new legislation was nothing short than the restoration of trust, leading to the restoration of the French economy as a whole. Now, certainly there were other aspects involved in that transformation. James Lively talks about how the Directory undertook massive infrastructure projects like canals and so forth that helped connect different parts of the French economy with new markets. So this law was occurring simultaneous to some of these other major economic reforms accomplished by the Directory. However, at the same time, it was an incredibly important law because it based credit on the principles of transparency, which when compounded with these other economic reforms and new military victories abroad, which brought in new specie to help revitalize some of these credit markets, allowed France to find its economic footing again. Well, that leads to another question, which is simply, if hypothèque is so important to the economic functionality of France, why did it take revolutionaries until 1798 to reform this institution? They had, in fact, tried to reimagine hypothèque from the very beginning of the revolution, as you can see with this quote from Jacques Necker, who was very involved in the early stages of the revolution. He suggested a discount fund that would function much like the Bank of England, issuing its own paper currency and helping the French nation fund its various expenses, as well as pay off its debts. But Neckar's plan was rejected by the National Assembly, which was entrusted with writing the new constitution for France. This quote is from Nakar in his argument on behalf of his discount fund, where he says the first condition necessary for founding trust is the certitude between the revenues and the expenses of the state. In other words, matching the debts or the expenses of the state with some form of collateral, or one might say hypothèque. Now, Nakar's plan for a discount bank is rejected in part because it reminded deputies of John Law's failed experiment with a national bank and paper currency, but in its place, they create the assignat. And as you can read, it reads hypothèque sur les domaines nationaux, so the national domain, or bien nationaux. Now, the national domain consisted of properties that had been confiscated from the Catholic Church by revolutionaries. Why does the National Assembly choose to confiscate the church's property? This might have had more to do with the unique status of clerical properties, since they were immune from lawsuits, just like the king's properties were. It already granted them a quasi-public status in the view of revolutionaries. So it was perhaps not as great of a leap as some historians have maintained for the revolution to nationalize church lands when it was already being treated in some ways as a public resource. But their decision to tie the lands of the church to the assignat was indeed a fateful one. It is not, in fact, until the assignat fails that revolutionaries are able to reform l'hypothèque, this time by returning to the principles of publicity and the formalized procedures first outlined during the monarchy. The long-term implications of this transition were enormous, and I'll end with this slide. The conservation of hypothèque and registry offices created a blueprint for the cadastre, a survey of all landed property within France, a key step in the accurate levying of land taxes. It not only replenished credit markets as creditors were able to lend again with confidence, but it also set the stage for modern banking in France. The oversight of peer-to-peer lending by hypothèque registry offices gradually gave way to private banking as the principle of publicity of hypothèque that was included in the Law of 11 Brumaire from 1798 was ended in 1804 with the introduction of the Napoleonic Code. These procedures that had been standardized under the Directory and slightly altered by the 1804 Civil Code reverberate throughout and down through the 19th century, especially as Napoleon exports the Napoleonic Code throughout Europe. This is from a letter to Emperor Napoleon III from one of the founders of the Crédit Foncier de France, a new bank that expanded French investment abroad. What does the new bank use as collateral for its investments? As you can see, it mentions that independently of the personal guarantee of the borrowers is the real and immovable guarantee of l'hypothèque. By transforming l'hypothèque from a mere clause buried in old regime notarized contracts into the registration of real property in government-run offices, the French Revolution underwrote the trust needed to secure capitalist exchange. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Zach. We'd love to take questions at this point. If you would go ahead and put them in the chat, we think that's probably the best way to handle it. Oh, that's interesting. Your screen is sort of frozen in the unshare position.
Oh, yes. Should I need to unshare, right? Or
well, I think aren't you? You seem to be trying to unshare, and at least on my screen, it's sort of, I don't know. It's fine. People can ask questions under these circumstances. I don't see why not.
Let's see if I can. Okay, it said that I believe I stopped sharing, but it could be, it says sharing is paused. Oh, I need to hit stop share. Okay, now we're good.
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay. We'd really like to start with questions about Zach's excellent work. If you could put them in the chat, that would be fantastic. Dr. Blaufarb has a question and
Yes,
comment,
of course,
I think.
Dr. Bleffarb.
Yeah, Zach, I really like this kind of thing, and I thought you did a great job. I do have a suggestion for how you can underline the importance of this institution you're looking at. You said that every loan, public or private, of 100 livre or more had to be notarized and had to have essentially had to have a hypothec condition placed on it. That is so extraordinary because I'm not sure that everyone understands. 100 livre alone is maybe 10 English pounds at the time. So essentially what you're saying is that all public credit in old regime France, as well as all significant private credit, is backed up by this legal instrument, which is virtually to say that the entire credit system of France depends on this, or at least associates the hypothec to it, which is, that's kind of important because all of this literature on credit that you cited doesn't even mention this instrument. But it would seem that credit in its public and private forms depend upon this thing.
Yeah, definitely, because from what I've seen in the archives, the notarial archives and other sources is, and it makes total sense. I mean, if you are contracting a loan with somebody you don't know, their word alone it's not going to be enough to satisfy your any doubts you might have about their trustworthiness. But if they actually agree to include in the contract itself the hypothec clause setting aside their property as a guarantor for the repayment of that loan, you're going to feel a lot better about lending that person money. So it totally makes sense when you think about just the underlying mechanisms of trust that are needed for this kind of economic exchange, certainly still today. Which is why I'm calling it really a modern phenomenon, because it's impersonal and it's not reputation based solely on reputation. But I should mention that Hoffman and his co-authors do briefly talk about it. They say in their work, they acknowledge that the annuities and obligations they're looking at are backed by hypothec, but they don't talk at all about the efforts by the monarchy during the old regime to really regulate this process, to combat fraud, to help try and prop up credit markets by introducing these new laws that are designed to bring transparency and trust to economic exchange. They don't talk about that at all, really. In their mind, they're very invested in the narrative of notaries providing that trust, or that crucial component that would otherwise be missing from these exchanges. But as I talk about in the presentation, I think there's reasons to cast doubts upon some of their findings, not entirely, but they are focused only on Paris. And once you get outside of Paris, notaries, the roles that notaries take, that they take on within the general economic system of economic exchange, are not like those that are happening in Paris. There's not these high, it's not this same level of high finance. They're not dealing with financiers, or they're dealing just with small landowners or wealthier peasants and so forth. So there's a real difference, even just how notaries function between Paris and the countryside. But anyway, I think their study is very useful. I don't mean to totally discredit it, but. And anybody else that wants to just speak and rather than typing out their question, that's perfectly fine by me. But
I'm going to go ahead and jump in with that invitation then, because being an academic, I just have to have this long and rambling thing that I'd hate to have to sort of condense down into, actual text. But Zach, I would just say, I mean, I've had the pleasure of having multiple conversations with you over many years about Epotech, right? And one of the things maybe that I'm really kind of curious about is that you've gone through several different sort of formulations, I think, in trying to talk about why it's significant and how important it is, what its relationship is to the revolution and the old regime. And I really I really think it's exciting, this like version that it's turning into now, some of the things that you're able to say about it. And sort of the impersonal aspects, especially, I think seem really strong and kind of tie in with some of what James Vernon is doing, sort of with Society of Strangers. But one of the things too, so maybe if you could either speak on that a little bit, since you're nodding, but the point I was going to go to with that would be to say, what was it about Epotech when you first found it, right? It seems like you identified it early on that there was something really significant about that. And you've been trying to figure out exactly sort of what it is or what is the biggest version of that. But maybe for the benefit of folks who are going to be going to the archives early on, if you could talk a little bit about what got you to identify this as really important when the rest of the literature wasn't, and then how did you go about like hanging on to that and developing that as a process?
Yeah, real quick to discuss, that's a great question. And to discuss James Vernon, I thought of that work frequently throughout this process because, yeah, this idea of thinking about, extracting individuals from their larger community and thinking about them as not autonomous, not completely autonomous necessarily, but that came to mind several times throughout writing this dissertation. But to address your question, I initially thought that I would write about several of the lawyers involved with the writing of the Napoleonic Code. I had a list of about 6 lawyers. And in 2016, some graduate students, myself included, were given the opportunity to go to Paris and do some research in the archives there in Pierrefitte. And before I had left on that trip, Dr. Blaufarb had brought Epotech to my attention, and he gave me some documents to look through, and I started to look through them. And but quite honestly, I couldn't really make heads or tails of it. It just seemed to be confusing and difficult to understand. But while I was in Paris on that research trip, I realized that if I hoped to write this work on these 6 lawyers, that it would take me down all these different avenues because they were incredibly prolific. So I would end up writing about everything from laws on marriage to Epotech to laws concerning wills and so forth. They just were very involved in so many different revisions to the French legal code that it would take me down so many different paths. It just felt very overwhelming. So paradoxically, Epotech seemed less overwhelming after that trip. And surely enough, I had found a lot of sources while I was there in Paris relevant to Epotech. So I came back from that trip in 2016 and met with Dr. Blaufarb and said, hey, I think I might want to do this instead because this is just one issue rather than a whole list of various, incredibly important, but nevertheless, thanks, Dr. Sinke, nevertheless, really overwhelming new laws and new legislation that was being crafted by these 6 individuals. So that's kind of how I arrived at the topic, was with Dr. Blaufarb's prodding, but also, just kind of poking around in the archives and finding stuff. So.
Thank you.
take us to the writing portion, I was just thinking that you had something so important to say about how you formulate a complicated project and how you research it. And in particular, you mentioned at the beginning that having the money was very helpful in terms of getting it written. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and why it was so important to have that money and how you sort of structured your time and what advice you would give to somebody who's sort of at the beginning of that process?
Yeah, certainly. So I started writing the dissertation in the summer of 2019 after I had taught in that spring semester. And I got my first draft of chapter 1 done that summer. But I realized I was going to have to revise this draft. That was by no means complete. And then I taught the fall of 2019, and then I had the Martin Veggie for the spring of 2020. Our son was born January 15th, 2020. So that took up a lot of my initial time, just experiencing that adjustment. An adjustment that, unbeknownst to us, was simply going to continue indefinitely as we were housebound. But in any case, the way that I ended up structuring my time was I tried to focus on writing at least the drafts of the first 3 chapters, and then working on revising those 3 drafts. So I started revising the first draft, but also as I was revising the first draft and of chapter 1, I should say, I understood better how my second chapter would develop. So then I started on the second chapter. And then as I revised that helped lead to the third chapter, as there were things I wasn't able to include in the second chapter or that didn't quite fit. So I sort of would put them in a separate file and then tackle those later in the third chapter. So that was how I used that time, was focusing on the first 3 chapters, but also very much immersing myself in a lot of the secondary literature, because there was not very much written on this, but there is plenty out there in terms of political economy and economic history, and works looking at, say, how the Habsburgs funded their wars, which was somewhat similar to this system, or The Sinews of Power by John Brewer, other works that talked about similar mechanisms of war funding that I also immersed myself in to try and think about how I was going to approach this topic. So I'm now getting closer to the end of it, but and with each draft, I felt like, especially with Dr. Blaufarb's help, I felt like they've gotten better and better and a little bit more focused and a little bit more succinct, because I definitely also ended up going down a lot of rabbit trails, which I may or may not be typical with this experience. This is the first time I've ever done it, but where you have to go back and just delete whole swaths of writing because you've just spent way too much time talking about something that really probably in the long run doesn't add that much. So anyway, that has been my personal experience, but I'm not sure how it is for other people. That's just for me.
Well, it always helps to hear, even if everybody has to make their own path, it always helps to hear about other people's, because it allows you to sort of mix and match and make your own. And I would also say that I think going down rabbit trails is helpful in the end, but maybe that's just because I'm always doing it and I have to believe it. But I give you that endorsement.
Yeah, sometimes there's something good at the end there where had you not done it, you might not have gotten there. So, yeah.
Can I ask a general question again?
Yeah.
This is about, I'm sorry, I'm very much into the content, but this is sort of tangential to what you're actually researching, Zach. You've read so much, you've read so much in, 18th century French sources. And you started, I want to ask you about the ubiquity of credit as a metaphor, just in general, not specifically about this legal instrument, but you began with this anecdote, basically saying like an elderly, sick person is over mortgaged, I mean, do you have any thoughts about credit as simply a metaphor for understanding kind of everything in old regime France. I mean, can we talk about like a I don't know, culture of credit, discourse of credit, a kind of like credit as a model for understanding all kinds of things that are not financial at all?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, when these lawyers during the 16th century are writing about hypothek, or just credit in general, you know, a lot of them are talking about the patronage system that existed in ancient Rome. They're comparing the hierarchy of social relations within France to what they see as ancient Rome, or at least how they understand it to have functioned or existed. And say that there's definitely a culture of credit that is underlying a lot of the conceptual work that's being done at this time by lawyers. It's a question of who owes what to whom, if that makes sense. And in some cases, those are financial obligations, but in other cases, for example, Seigneurie de Moulin talks at length about how the payment of feudal dues is in fact merely an exercise of social respect. It's not actually about the whatever's brought to your feudal lord, whether it's a chicken or 3 sheaves of wheat. That's irrelevant. What actually matters is paying homage to your lord once a year, going from your home to his house, entering his house, and making your oaths of loyalty again, and granting him with this really just not that important gift of produce or whatever you happen to bring. So that culture of thinking about credit is constant among these lawyers at this time. They're trying to rethink who owes what to whom, and how a properly ordered society would function, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to talk about the constitutional order of France, which relates to the powers of the king, which relates to seigneurie. And when I say constitutional order, they're not talking about a written constitution. They're talking about it in terms of like a living understanding of what kind of powers certain people within society should enjoy. So you have a lot of literature being produced just talking about even like the credit of the monarchy and the credit of vassals and lords and so forth. So yeah, I think Claire Crowson's entirely correct that a lot of what's being talked about are social relations, not necessarily financial credit. Where I think that she would benefit from more nuance is thinking about financial credit, not solely as a social relationship, but also as an economic relationship grounded in something, the gage of the piece of property that has been used as hypothek, that's mediating this creditor-debtor relationship. Yeah.
Actually, maybe one question that kind of follows up on that a little bit, or sort of takes it just off this idea about, you had said at the start, right, the idea of the state as sort of this just kind of collection of obligations, right? And that kind of definition of the state is something that Margot Kennedy and a lot of other people sort of use in work that's more central to my field. And it just made me think, right, because when these scholars are using it, they're using it to talk about the ways in which the state can formulate identity, right, through these sort of obligations and the nature of these obligations that it creates between people. It actually kind of creates or can create identity within the individual, or create state mechanisms that reinforce certain identities and certain ways of thinking about the self and disparage others, right? And so I'm just wondering if that maybe an idea of identity is anything that might potentially be there, like within your records or within this, right? The ways in which the state is operating is reinforcing specific ways that people think about themselves, right? And identity.
That's absolutely happening. I mean, what they're doing, the monarchy's doing by selling these annuities to its own subjects, it's making them shareholders in some ways of the sovereignty of the monarchy, and it's making them identify with the longer term success or flourishing of the monarchy. If the monarchy is not flourishing, they might not receive, annuity payments that year. Let's say that they've lost a war or something like that. So it's creating identity among these holders of government annuities who are thinking of themselves more and more as a block that thinks of themselves more and more as citizens with certain prerogatives, and that's been covered somewhat in Michael Sonnenscheur's work, From Deficit to Deluge, in which he posits that representative democracy as it's emerging during the French Revolution is an effort by holders of people who are invested in the monarchy, wanting to actually control the purse strings, so that for example, holders of government annuities will be repaid rather than the king consistently defaulting on his loans and not repaying his debtors. So I think there's definitely something there to new ideas of new categories of identity that are being formed through these relationships, not just creditor debtor, but even just as thinking about like the idea of what a citizen is, or the amount of investment a citizen has in as say like a taxpayer or a holder of government debt. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I love that idea, the way you got, especially at the end, like changing the idea of what a citizen is and what people think about that. I mean, I think that would be something to really kind of run with if at all possible. And you'd have a lot of support with, again, people like Margot Kennedy's work that does a lot with that.
Thanks, Dr. Upter.
Well, this has been a very good conversation. Does anybody have anything else they want to add?
I'll just say thank you again for attending the talk and for all the help and support from Martin Veggie family and the history department. It's much appreciated. Thanks.
Zach, we really want to thank you. And if anybody has any questions in the future about the kind of fellowship that you had, we invite them to contact the committee for assistance.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Zach. It was very good.
Thanks, Dr. Lafleur.